Hi, everyone. Welcome to Bible Discoveries, the weekend show where we discuss big questions that pop up as we're reading through the Bible, because that's what we're doing. We're reading through the Bible this year. We also aim to discuss and answer viewer questions, so questions that you send in to us via the comment section or email that you can find on our website. So yeah, if this is your first time here, my name is Corie, and I'm always joined by my husband, Matlock. Hey, Matlock.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. How about you today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah?
Yeah. Doing good. All right, so today we're discussing 2 Samuel 8 to 1 Kings 7. So that's pretty exciting because we're getting into the life of David.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and some beginning this section of the kings of Israel and Judah. So always really interesting. So that was our assigned reading for this weekend. So today our big question is going to be, how should we understand the Davidic covenant? But we're also going to be jumping in and discussing David's bizarre family. I mean, he had it pretty rough, so we're going to be discussing that. We're also going to be taking a look at the length of David's reign and even a bit of King Solomon's reign as well. So yeah, do you want to just jump into our first question for today?
Yeah, that's right. Let's do it. So I'll open up, and this question is related to 2 Samuel 13 to 15.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if David was such a great king, why was his family so messed up? And why doesn't the Bible criticize David for not addressing his family issues?
Right.
So 2 questions in one, but they're related. And I will say this off the cuff, is that it's not just his family that's messed up. David's kind of life starts off well, and it kind of starts crumbling after with Bathsheba and stuff like that.
Yeah, he's guilty of adultery. He's guilty of murder. But we also see David beginning to lose his grasp on the kingdom. I mean, as you read, we see his. I mean, that first part of the question: if David was such a great king, why was his family so messed up? So I'm assuming here that we're talking about. I mean, we see Amnon, who rapes his sister, his half-sister, so David's daughter. So that's extremely messed up. And then we see David not punishing Amnon for that at all. And so Tamar's full brother, Absalom, David's other son, he ends up executing Amnon for that, which Amnon, did deserve punishment and potentially even capital punishment based on the law. That needed to be something that was brought before a judge in Israel, but it was not. But then Absalom goes on. He moves on from murdering Amnon, his brother, and he launches a full-scale rebellion against David. But this isn't the only rebellion that happens amongst David's children. We see other sons of David also trying to declare themselves king before Solomon is finally officially made king. And we see a rift in David's leadership. The fact that Israel does back Absalom, and there's this civil war, within Israel. So at the beginning of David's reign, you've got his reign over Israel and Judah together. You've got the people coming to David and making him king and really being united over this. And then by the end of David's reign, the kingdom is so fractured that David has such a tenuous hold on it. So if David was such a great king, why was his family so messed up? I think that the text seems to indicate that David did not deal with the sins of his children. And we can speculate a lot for that. He does not seem to have brought discipline to his family. But also, we can see that David multiplied wives. And when we look at the hints in the text, we can understand why. Now, multiplication of wives was outlawed in Deuteronomy 17 for the kings of Israel. The reason of this is not necessarily because it goes against the sanctity or the original intention of God's idea of marriage, which it certainly does. We see, in Genesis, God creates Adam and Eve and he inaugurates marriage. So one man and one woman in Genesis. And then we see in the Gospels, Jesus going back to that model and saying, like, he backs that, this is God's intention for marriage, one man and one woman for life without any other, experiences outside of that in terms of, human sexuality. So that is God's plan for marriage. But in Deuteronomy 17, The rules for kings all seem to have to do with where the king is putting their trust. And in the ancient world, kings got married for political reasons. And we see David doing this. So he has several wives that are described in Hebrew, not anything like Solomon. I think David just has 7 wives. But we know, for example, he married Absalom's mother, who was a Geshurite princess. Now, Geshur was a land just north of the Sea of Galilee, within the confines of what should have been the land of Israel. But the Israelites had failed to get rid of the Geshurites, to push them out of the land during the time period of the conquest, and had instead made covenants with them, so they were living in the land. So David, when he was fighting against the house of Saul for the control of Israel, he married this Geshurite princess. And what that would have done would have been to secure the political and military support of the land of Geshur and the king of Geshur to solidify David's kingship. So we see him doing this. So I would say that we could really draw out from the text that a huge portion of David's familial problems came from the fact that he had gone against God's law and he had multiplied wives. And this really complicates the family. We see it back with Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah. We see it with Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, and the concubines of Jacob. And we see it here with David, the infighting between the children. So that's definitely one reason why David's family was so messed up.
And I would say this too, to part to the second question, why doesn't the Bible criticize David for not addressing his family issues? The Bible doesn't criticize a lot of things that it frowns upon. Like everything's filtered through the eyes of the law at this point.
Right.
So it's like if you know the law, Deuteronomy 17, these things, you would know that certain things aren't supposed to happen. And so therefore you get if you're reading the Bible carefully, you're kind of getting a grip with, oh, okay, well, David shouldn't have done that. Oh, David shouldn't have done that. And then looking at it through the eyes of the law, you don't need to have the Bible be like, and David did this wrong every single time David did something wrong. Like it's just kind of implied, it's implicit. It's like he did something wrong because it already said earlier in the text that he shouldn't have done something wrong.
Right.
So I think that, does the Bible criticize David for not addressing his family? I think it does. I think it's implied in the text that he is doing things wrong. I think it's 2 Samuel 13. It even says David didn't deal with this when I think it was the rape of his daughter. Yeah. He didn't deal with it. And it just says that. And it kind of is it's like a sentence, I believe. And you're kind of like, oh, he should have dealt with that. It's a high context culture, which means that it relies on your personal understanding to fill in the gaps there. It's not a low context culture, which means that you have to say every single detail so that there's nothing left out. And it just assumes, the text assumes that you have some sort of conscious and grip on reality. Some sort of common knowledge among, of the text. Anyways.
Yeah, there's different ways that the Bible criticizes, right? So sometimes the Bible records outright criticisms that happened historically. So we see the prophet Nathan confronting David with several times. Once with the wise woman Joab uses a wise woman to confront David in the text, and the prophet Nathan confronts David as well for his murder and adultery. So there is outright criticism that the Bible records that actually happened historically. And then another way that the Bible criticizes is just by what it includes historically. We know that it doesn't include all of the things that David did while he was king. It just gives us a rundown of his life. So the things that it does choose to include are there for a reason. And it shows us the downfall of Amnon, of Tamar, and of Absalom. It shows us how David went from a king who was chasing after God's own heart and trying to follow the law. It shows how he stopped following the law in several key aspects. And then it chooses to show all of the chaos that happened to David and how he almost lost his entire kingdom, except for the faithfulness of God. So it shows the progression of King David's life. It didn't have to show us that. It could have just summarized his life. It could have just not put in all of the unsavory details of Amnon and Tamar and Absalom, but it chose to do so anyway. So that is a criticism that, like you're saying, it's implied in the text.
Right.
And so that's a purpose that we have to draw out of that.
Yeah, for sure.
So it definitely does criticize David's decisions to not follow God, but it just doesn't record a moment where Nathan came to David and said, you should not be marrying all these women. You should be disciplining your children. Although it's possible that those things did happen, it doesn't record it in that way. It just records what happened and then the aftermath. And it's left up to us, the reader, to go, oh, wow, I definitely don't want to do that.
Right.
I want to live differently than that.
And then also, too, then you have to ask yourself, which is kind of the next question on top of that. Okay, so why would the text not explicitly address it? So, for instance, when Ahab's evil or someone's being evil, it's like, and he was the most evil king.
Right.
It just outright says this guy is just plainly evil, and doesn't get. Sometimes it gets into detail, sometimes it doesn't. So then you ask yourself, okay, so why is the text not explicitly addressing it? Well, a lot of the times it's trying to draw you in more into the narrative more to guide you down a path, and then it will ultimately address it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not going to address each time. It's going to be like, it was wrong and this was wrong. It's not just trying to give you, it's not just trying to be a moral rule book in this sense. It's giving you a history, it's painting you a narrative so that you can see through the context and the lens of the ancient world, like what is wrong here. And that's, you can't devoid moral problems from its greater narrative and context. So I think that's important too. It's not just about listing the do's and don'ts of the rights and wrongs. It's really about getting you into what this narrative is and the patterns of these guys' lives so you can fully understand the idea behind it. So I think it's also intentional a lot of the time. It's not just left out for the assumption also that you know the law. It's also trying to draw you in more to understand. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so that's my other point.
Yeah, well, and also when you read through Kings and Chronicles, you know, at the end of a king's reign, there's often a summary statement, like you were saying, with you kind of paraphrased the summary statement of Ahab's reign, right? And not everything that they did is taken is described. They're kind of graded on a scale. Even good kings, where it'll say, you know, this king was a good king, except that he didn't that he tolerated the high places, or he didn't get rid of the high places. So there's this rating scale here for the king. So it's really, that in and of itself is interesting, where, you know, one sin does not in and of itself make a king good or bad, but they were judged more on a scale of how they shepherded and how they led Israel and Judah. And from that standpoint, from the standpoint of all those who would come after him, David was a very good king.
Right.
Because his whole life, despite the drawbacks, he really was trying to follow God and trying to organize the kingdom around the worship of God rather than the worship of himself or the worship of false gods.
Yes.
So overall, he did pretty good.
Right.
He did pretty good, but he definitely made mistakes.
Big mistakes,
so, yeah, big mistakes.
All right, I'll ask you this.
Oh, sure.
All right, so this is related to 1 Kings 1 and 2, both chapters.
Okay,
so
go there.
Both books, I should say. I like the weekly updates that review the weekly Bible topics done by your fine family. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
How long was David king of Israel? And so I forgot to mention this by Gary Clayton.
Okay. Hey, Gary. Yes. So for this, we have to go back to 2 Samuel chapter 5, which is where it gives a rundown at the beginning of David's reign. And it's talking about when David became king over Israel. So at the beginning of David's reign, he was not king over all of Israel. He was only king over his own tribe, the tribe of Judah, and he ruled in the city of Hebron. And the Bible tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 5 that he ruled in Hebron for 7 years and 6 months, just over the tribe of Judah, and that he was 30 years old when he started that reign. So he would have been 37 and a half-ish when the other tribes of Israel came to David and asked him, they accepted him as king over them as well. And so then David became king over united Israel and Judah, and he reigned over that united kingdom for 33 years. So overall, he had a reign of just over 40 years.
Just like his son.
Yeah.
Roughly about 40 years. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
well,
so it was kind of split up, but...
I think that's the answer.
Yeah, it is the answer. So
Yeah.
2 Samuel
You
5
did it, yeah.
again is where you can find that. And I know it's not exactly like, it can be confusing because in the rest of the Kings and Chronicles, we know exactly where to find the king's reigns. It's either at the very beginning of the account of the reigns or the very end, which is generally in the same chapter. But with David, his story is so spread out and it's told a few different times. So 2 Samuel 5 is where you can find that. Thanks, Gary. Okay, do you want to answer this next? Can I ask you this next question? We can kind of talk about it. Okay, this is from Dave and Marie.
Okay.
And they say, hi, Dave and Marie. First of all, they say this: we were wondering how to picture the mechanics of God speaking with Solomon. This is from 1 Kings chapter 3. Speaking with Solomon and emphasizing covenant terms. Do we know if Solomon, for example, experienced direct voice or prayer response or through other priestly contact? How did the Old Testament writers view this context through which God would reveal his plans to earthly leaders?
Okay. For one, so a couple chapters to take into consideration here. 1 Kings 3, 1 Kings 8, 9, and 11.
So these are all instances where God speaks to Solomon?
Yes, or even when Solomon prays. So for example, 1 Kings 8, Solomon prays on the dedication of the temple. And in 1 Kings 9, God responds to that. So then that seems like a direct response. So unlike, let's say, God speaks through Nathan, comes to David, and he's like, look what you've done, right? In this case, God seems like he's speaking directly to Solomon. And that's what you see in 1 Kings 3 as well. God meets him in a dream. He's directly speaking to Solomon. And also, too, in 1 Kings 11, from what I recall, when King Solomon starts walking away, God speaks directly to Solomon. So you have something really interesting here where Solomon is not just, he is a prophet. Like he wrote books of the Bible. So God is speaking directly to him, which also makes his apostasy a little bit worse in a sense. Because it's not like he is someone who is just trying to live by the law to do their best. He's actually has a relationship with God in some sense. That would be the answer to that part where it says, is it a direct voice or prayer response? Is it an audible voice that Solomon's hearing, or is it an internal voice? I don't know. The Bible doesn't say the difference. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it kind of clarifies that, like, for instance, I think in the New Testament, when Jesus is being baptized, people hear God speaking, this is my son whom I am well pleased. Some people hear thunder, and other people hear the actual words of God. Which is fascinating. So it's like, you have some people who don't hear the words of God, they just hear thunder, and they're like, whoa. And so you have something there where it's like, okay, it's an audible voice, it's external of you, but it's not like everyone can hear at the same time. So maybe something like that's happening here where it's just...
Well, I think with this instance specifically where it says God, it literally says God appears to Solomon when he's sleeping. And then you can compare that to 2 Chronicles 1 verse 7, which says that night God appeared to Solomon. So I think it's safe to say it's in a dream, but because it says appeared, it was like
it's a lucid dream.
He could see him, he could speak with him. So yeah, I think that, we're not given details as to what that looked like. Was it the angel of the Lord? Was it God? We're not given that, but we know that it was a dream. As opposed to like a prophet coming to him, or as opposed to Urim and Thummim or something like that. Because I think you can also go, what's really interesting is we can know, thanks to 1 Samuel, we can know what kings of this time period how they expected to hear from God. And there was 3 ways that they were expected to hear from God. Because in 1 Samuel 28, this is when King Saul, he ends up going to the Witch of Endor because he tries to communicate with God in all of the biblically approved ways to communicate with God, and God is not answering him because he has been cast off as the king of Israel. His judgment is coming. He is under God's judgment at this point. So in 1 Samuel 28, verse 6, I'll go back to 5. So I'm going to read 5 and 6. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. So the three ways that at least Saul and these early kings of Israel expected to hear from God was by the priest. So the priest wielded the Urim and the Thummim. So the king would ask a question and the priest would, cast the Urim and the Thummim. He expected to hear from God in dreams or dreams, like visions, while you're sleeping, and also by a prophet of God. So a prophet would come to you and give you a word of God. And so then when we jump into 1 Kings 3 and 2 Chronicles 1, we see Solomon inquiring of God. So he goes to Gibeon where the tent tabernacle is because the temple hasn't been built yet. And he offers sacrifices and inquires of God through the priests. And then he expects to get an answer from God. And how God chooses to answer him is a dream as he's sleeping that night.
Right.
So.
And it's not just limited to those three, because the angel of the Lord is a physical appearance of some kind.
Sure.
Right. So you have a humanoid appearance, right? Mm-hmm. It's in a human form.
Yeah, which we see Joshua, for example. The angel of the Lord appearing to Joshua back in Joshua, and in Judges chapter 2, the angel of the Lord appears and actually walks up.
Moses in the burning bush is the angel of the Lord.
Yes,
right. So,
but at least we know from 1 Samuel 28 what kings of this time period would expect. They
it's
expected
like a more normal
these three ways: Urim and Thummim,
it is the common
dreams
form.
Or visions, prophet of God. That's what they expected.
Yeah, the angel of the Lord is not coming all the time. But the idea here is that this is the common expectations,
right? As
opposed to, you should expect the angel of the Lord like anytime he talks to you. It's like, no, that's not the case,
right?
But there's another part to this question.
Sure.
I'm trying to wrap my head around. How did the Old Testament writers view this contact through God?
Which God? Yeah.
Through which God would reveal His plans to earthly leaders?
How did they view it? How did they envision it?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the best way to answer this. How did the Old Testament writers view this context through which God would reveal His plans to earthly leaders? I think that we've kind of touched on it already, but I think that as in terms of Old Testament writers, these guys are prophets, right? Like Samuel's writing Samuel, largely Gad or Nathan, and probably the second Samuel.
Yeah.
They are intimately involved in the king's lives, anyways. So David. Right, wrote Psalms. So these people all have intimate contact with God. So I don't know exactly how to answer these questions. What do you think?
I think it's the same way that I think like they wrote down these expectations in 1 Samuel 28, for example. They're the ones who wrote down what was going on. So I think the answer is the same. I think they envisioned God speaking to these kings in the same way. And as their unique, like they had a unique viewpoint because they were prophets of God. So they regularly received dreams and visions and words of God. So obviously they would have had experiential knowledge of this as well. I mean, when you look at the succession of people who are writing the Bible, these were prophets of God, men called of God to write these words. So they obviously would have had a unique perspective from an experiential point of view, but I think it's the same because they're the ones who wrote down that, Saul was looking for a dream. He was looking for a prophet of God to give him a word, or he was looking for the priest to be able to give him answers via the Urim and Thummim, and none of those occurred. And then they're the ones again who write down what Solomon did, the process that he went through. He went to a priest. He offered sacrifices on the altar of offering that Moses and the Israelites had built. Then that night he went to sleep and God spoke directly to him. God appeared to him, we're told. So there's some sort of vision going on in the dream. So yeah, I think it's a similar answer. Yeah. But I think that it is interesting to take a look, to try to think of it from their perspective, because they at least would have had experiential knowledge of this as well.
That's right. Yeah. I couldn't really wrap my head around the question itself, but I think you nailed it on the head.
I think that's where you were going with that question, David Marie. If not, please write us a comment or another email and clarify. But I think that's where they were going.
That's good.
Okay. So that brings us to our overarching big question that I want to discuss from our writing. So I want to discuss this idea of the Davidic covenant, because at the beginning of with David, God comes and he creates a covenant with him. So how should we understand this Davidic covenant as it weaves throughout throughout Scripture.
And climaxes with Christ, right? Christ is the climax of the Davidic covenant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have anything you want to start with?
Well, I think first of all, we have to understand the Davidic covenant within the context of God's plan of redemption. So very broadly speaking, we see that God is not surprised by human behavior, that as soon as Adam and Eve sin and separate themselves from God, in Genesis 3:15, God prophesies that someone will come who will crush the head of the snake. So there's this plan of redemption, the redemption of humanity by God, initiated immediately. And then as time goes on, we see this plan take form and take shape throughout the history that the Bible records. So first through the Abrahamic covenant. So God chooses a specific family line through which he is going to deliver all of mankind, right? So
Right.
then it goes, just generally there's going to be a deliverer. Then it gets more specific. It's going to come from the family of Abraham. And then we get to David and it gets even more specific. So not just from the broad family of Abraham, but now specifically the Messiah is going to come through a line of kings, specifically the line of kings that are related to David. So from the Davidic dynasty. So that's how we need to understand it in a broad scale, that when God makes this covenant with David, he's saying that the Messiah is going to come from David's line. Therefore, David will always have an ancestor on the throne.
Right. I think that's
like the broad scale.
Yeah, of course. So let me just read it, because 2 Samuel 7. Let's just read. Yeah. Just for some people might not even be aware of it. I'm assuming you've read. You should have read your Bible.
Should have read.
Yeah, but,
I know.
But if you haven't, let's just read it here. 2 Samuel 7 verse 8. I'll start there.
Mm-hmm.
Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, speaking to Nathan. Okay. Thus says the Lord of hosts. I took you from the pasture, speaking to David, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make you for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. That is now true. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place, and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more, as formerly from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. This is what you were talking about here.
Yes.
When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, when you die, basically, I will raise up your offspring after you. Who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, in accordance with the vision, Nathan spoke to David. Okay. Mm-hmm. So you have a lot going on there. But long story short, as you said, is about the Messiah coming through. There is something that's interesting here, which we were talking about earlier, which I'll address again. It says here, which this might give some people off. There's some people who might be like, is this referring to the Messiah? Because look what it says. When he commits iniquity, we're assuming this is the Messiah, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men, but my steadfast love will not depart from him. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it says he will commit iniquity. What's your take on this?
Right. Well, I would say the immediate context of this prophecy is Solomon, right? It's going to be Solomon. And then the son of Solomon, and then the grandson, and on and on and on. So the initial context of this is David's physical line. So I mean, you need to take this literally. I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, who the immediate one was Solomon, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name. So Solomon builds the temple, right? And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So this is where it's like, okay, well, Solomon's obviously not going to literally live forever, but there's going to be a line of kings that come from David and Solomon who will reign on the throne of Jerusalem.
It's funny that we don't remember Jeroboam, but remember David and Solomon. Their names are their names are built into our cultural consciousness. Like everyone knows who they are. And then Rehoboam comes, everyone's like, who?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's like those two guys. It's just interesting because they're the great men of the earth that God said he would establish. Go ahead.
Yes. So I will be his father. He will be my son. We see that interesting relationship between God and Solomon, where God says to David, Solomon is the one that I love, and he is going to be the king. And then God gifts Solomon with good gifts, which we're going to talk about on our next weekend show, because those good gifts go very bad. They go awry, but we'll talk about that later. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, which certainly happens especially to the kings that follow Solomon, right? We see in that very next generation after Solomon, Pharaoh Shishak invades the land and basically takes all of the wealth that Solomon had amassed. And then there's a lot of enemies going on here. So, that whole being punished for iniquity, I don't see that as Christ in the immediate context. I see that as the physical line of David, who we're not Christ, because obviously Christ was without sin, he was without iniquity. But what is interesting is continuing on, my love will never be taken away from him as I took it away from Saul. So God did not remove the kingdom away from Solomon, even though he was evil. So that promise came true. And it says, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So we know that when the line of kings of David ceases, because they go into judgment, into the Babylonian exile for 70 years, it is expected that a Messiah from the line of David will come and take up that throne, which of course Christians believe was Jesus Christ as the physical offspring of David and the spiritual offspring of God, coming and becoming a king, now reigning, and his reign is not over. It's never going to end. There will come a time where there will be a new heavens and a new earth with Christ literally on the throne as he is now. But I think it's really interesting to look at then this prophecy through the lens of Christ as a physical descendant of David as well, and a legal descendant of David. So we see Christ is punished, not for his own iniquity, but for the iniquity of his creation, his people, and his ancestry, the ancestry of David, because the kings of David failed spectacularly in following God. I mean, you look at, there's only a handful of kings who came from David who actually tried to follow God. Only a handful of them. So many of the rest of them fell into idolatry. So Jesus is paying not only for the sins of the world, but also for the iniquity of his fathers, for the iniquity of David and Solomon and Rehoboam, and I mean, go down the line all the way to Zedekiah.
It's interesting because he says it's a double meanings. I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men.
Yeah.
So the stripes part is whipping, and that's that famous flogging scene you have.
It's really interesting how it all comes together.
So it seems like this is like Christ is redeeming in that process the Davidic line from their iniquities.
Yes.
Right, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And
he's essentially cleansing the throne that he will then take.
Right, so the he there is a double entendre. It's explicitly referring to Solomon, but then...
And the descendants of Solomon,
and
yes.
the descendants of Solomon, which must include the Messiah.
Yes.
Right, that's cool. All right, yeah, but there's other things too here that are related. So I got a bunch of verses here that are related to this Davidic covenant. So how should we understand it? Well, throughout as Solomon went on, everyone was expecting a Messiah to come. everyone was waiting for it and expecting it to be through the line of David. So here we have this is a famous one, Isaiah 9, verse 7. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So this kingdom can't end. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So you have this line, and we know this from Daniel, with the rock that's cut off from the mountain that's made by no human hands, and it spreads across the earth, right? So this kingdom that's coming out from the Messiah of David's kingdom. And you have more, if I even go on to Isaiah 11, verse 1, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And it keeps going on right there about what he's going to be like. So he's supposed to be a priest king to the utmost degree. Like he's going to love God with all of his heart, soul, strength, and mind, everything that you could possibly do. So that's what everyone's anticipating here, a priest king.
From that grand scheme of things, what you're really identifying here is from that grand redemption plan that God has. In the time of David, we get, okay, David's throne is going to last forever, so the kingdom is going to last forever through David. The Messiah is going to come through David. But then as we go on in the time period of the kings, we see David's descendants, his progeny, fail so spectacularly and so miserably, and God still enables them to stay on the throne until he brings judgment in the Babylonian captivity for 70 years. But in that time period where the family of David is failing in following God and his law, we have these prophets like Isaiah who are now prophesying, no, it's still going to happen, but it's going to happen it's going to be miraculous how this happens now, because God has promised that the throne of David is going to last forever, and here's how it's going to happen. Right. It's going to happen. There's going to be a branch coming out. So you get this idea that the house of David is going to be cut off. So the tree is going to be lopped off. But from that stump that remains, a shoot will grow once again. It's going to be miraculous. The tree is going to come back to life.
Right. And that's a Christian message, right?
Yes.
So, but more than just that. So to look at this, you have this priest king that's going to come. But what's interesting is this whole book is written, not to say from the view of a priest, but essentially from the view of prophets. So we would say religion and politics don't mix, kind of thing. And what you have here is something religious that's looking at political things. A religious figure being like, this is what politicians are doing wrong, essentially, in this sense. That's what the Bible's attacking them. That's the reason why Nathan can rebuke David. Like the political is subservient to the religious here. Yeah. By religious, I mean, Christ, God, and all that stuff. So here, when you have that in mind, that the priest is essentially superior than the king in a real way. Like they have different offices, they have different roles. But in terms of it, what is integral to the priest being a true king, for the king to be a true king is that priestly heart. To be a true king. So here what you have here is other things that are related to this idea. And this is the keys of David. I don't know if you ever studied this part. So here, I'll start off here with Isaiah 22, verse 22.
Sure.
And I will place on his shoulder, this is referring to one of the kings, the key of the house of David. He shall open and none shall shut it. And he shall shut, and none shall open. And I will fasten him like a peg in the secure place, and he will become a throne of honor in his father's house. Okay, so you have this key of David here, where things can be opened and closed, right? And that is eventually related to, you see this in Revelation, I think it's Revelation 3.
Yep.
With the Church of Philadelphia.
Yep.
And there's a door I shall open and not shut. That kingdom's still growing through, right? So we're part of the Davidic kingdom. which is a really fascinating concept, is that Christians are grafted into the Davidic
Mhm.
covenant. And that's this idea of the adoption of sonship. It's like you will be a prince, right?
Mhm.
The idea is that like when you die and you're saved for eternal life, you become a prince, a son of God.
Mhm.
And so you become in this Davidic line in a sense. So anyways, we have that opening, that key. The keys of David is important. And I know that's even likened to at times to the apostles. You shall whatever you shall bind.
Yeah, so it's symbolic of the authority of Christ that he
That's
then
right.
divvies out to his disciples.
That's exactly right. Whatever
Yeah.
you bind in heaven
And-
should be loosed. Right.
Yeah.
Right. It continues. So that's that. And I know there's others, Jeremiah 23 verse 5 and also chapter 30 verse 9. This is a good one. And this carries on. Everyone likens, Christ to this figure, to this priestly king figure. So even in, let's say, I'll go to Acts 13:4. Acts 13 verses 34. Let me just get there real fast.
We will all just stare at you awkwardly while you turn the pages of your
Yeah,
Bible.
that's right. I didn't have time to put it on my thing, so I'm just kind of going through here.
That's okay. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
Taking our time, getting through the
That's right.
scripture.
All right. And as for the fact that he raised him from the dead, this is about Christ, right? God raised Christ from the dead, no more to return to corruption. He has spoken in this way: I will give you the holy, sure blessings of David. Therefore, he says in the Psalm, you will not let your Holy One see corruption. For David, after he served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid with his fathers and saw corruption. But he whom God raised did not see corruption. Let it be known to you, therefore, brothers, that through this man forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. And by him, every one of you who believes is freed from everything from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. All right. So, and you even have later on with Paul in Romans saying part of his gospel is that Jesus is the son of David.
Yeah.
So here's what's really interesting here. So the gospel itself is intimately tied to the kingdom of David.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Do you see it? And that's something we forget. We forget like, so what does it need to have? What do you need to have a kingdom? Well, it's partly political. There's a king. You see what I'm saying here? So, but there's an order that's involved where the priest is superior than the king in a sense, because you need to have the heart of a priest.
Well, in as much as the priest represents God to the king. Yes. Same with prophet. The function of prophet was also, you didn't have a king without a prophet.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. You have that priest-king merger. So if it's a person,
right,
it's a priest. It's the same thing.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is that office of the priestly office is essentially the moral epicenter for the king. If the king is a priest, then it's all done. There's an irony I was thinking about. Plato longed for a philosopher king. He said the world will always be killing each other until the world has a philosopher king. And Solomon comes around and nothing changes.
Yeah.
But what the Bible's teaching is that you need a priestly king.
Yes.
Because that's what's going to change the world.
Let me put a caveat on this, however.
Sure.
That was actually outlawed in the Old Testament. It was not allowed because of human sinfulness. So the priests had to come from the tribe of Levi, and the kings came from the tribe of Judah.
Right.
It was separated because of human sinfulness. And now we do see crossover where David takes off his kingly robes and puts on a linen priestly ephod to dance and make music before God as they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. So he takes off his kingly authority apparently to symbolize the fact that God is king and David is but like a servant of God. So these offices in the Old Testament and until Christ came were very much separated because of human sinfulness. And we see that this really went a long way in attempting to hold back human evil, because how bad would it have been if, for example, Manasseh was also the priesthood. Now, he brought judgment upon himself and upon Jerusalem because he murdered the true priests of God and murdered the prophets of God according to, the Bible specifically just says he filled Jerusalem with blood, with innocent blood. But when you go back and you look into Jewish tradition, they talk about he was killing the prophets of God, he was killing the priests of God, which makes a whole lot of sense. But, it was separated, but then...
But that's important. It's so important to say that they were separated because
Yeah.
God purposely separated them,
Yes.
knowing that they're going to merge
That
to be a priest
he was going to, in the
Christ.
person of Christ.
Right. So, okay, so you
Yes.
have this thing. That, in a sense, that directionality, I think is very, when you see it, shows the temporalness of the law.
Yeah.
Because the law is going towards something, and at that point, with the priest king, the law is fizzled.
Yes.
You have something that's, do you see what I'm saying? The law, the Levites were the priests, and right, and then you have the king elsewhere in the line of Judah. So the two aren't related, and then they become related, and then you have to ask yourself, okay, so now that they've become related, the law itself is no longer is fulfilled in that, in a sense, which I think is really interesting, and it's interesting too to think that that's related to the gospel and how Paul talks about we're not bound by the law, right? Anyways.
Well, and this is why when you get into Hebrews, this is why the author of Hebrews, because this was a difficult concept for ancient Jews, because they were used to the law and they were used to certain teachings on that. Right. So the author of Hebrews comes back and he justifies Christ's high priesthood and kingship by going back to Melchizedek in Genesis.
Right.
So we see this in Hebrews chapter 7 and in Hebrews chapter 8 and even in Hebrews chapter 6 a little bit. So yeah, understanding that Christ is now the high priest and the king.
Right.
Which is again pulling back out to that plan of redemption where the kingdom of God God narrowed that first to the family of Abraham, narrowed it even more to the kingship of David. You know, the kings from David's line were going to rule over God's people, the family, the descendants of Abraham. And now in Christ, who has fulfilled all of that, reconciled human sin, the kingdom of God is now open, much more broad to all of humanity. Right. And so we have this culmination of the plan of redemption. And now what is left, what we are awaiting, is the return of Christ and the creation of the new heavens and the new earth, where we will be reconciled back to God like our pre-fallen state.
Right. So then you have the kingdom of God now is about the forgiveness of sins.
Yes.
Right. It's a big deal.
The reconciliation of humanity to God so that we can once again stand in the presence of God, not because of our righteousness, in fact, because of the acknowledgement of our unrighteousness and how we put on Christ's righteousness like clothes. Right. Just how God clothed Adam and Eve after the garden because their attempts at patching together clothes was not sufficient for survival in this earth. Right. So God now clothes us with the righteousness of God because our good works, our righteousness is wholly insufficient to protect us spiritually or to in any way protect us from the environment that we find ourselves in the presence of God. So God will, like he clothed Adam and Eve for protection in the physical world, so he clothes us in the righteousness of God for the spiritual world. Right. And this is very good news.
It's good.
Very, very, very good news for us.
Yeah.
So
I think there's more to be talked about, not for today, but about
we could talk about the Davidic covenant for a long time.
Yeah, because the relationship of what that kingdom means.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for kingship today? I know we kind of addressed that last time, but I think that there's more to talk about at least.
Definitely.
Right.
But maybe not for today.
Not for today.
For another day. For another day. Okay. If you have any questions or comments about this episode or future episodes, if you want us to address some of your questions or concerns about scripture that is still to come, please pop them down in the comment section down below or find our emails and email us. Until next time, happy reading, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for watching. We want to keep producing high-quality biblical content, but we can't do it without your support. If you feel called to support us, please click the link in the description under Donate. Your support really means a lot to us.